Here is a thought experiment that is going to break your brain. Game of Thrones ran for 8 seasons. 8 seasons of political chess, dragon fire, betrayal, and one of the most divisive finales in television history. But what if I told you that the show was never supposed to go that long, not because of budget, not because of contracts, but because of one man, one wound, and one witch who decided that technically keeping someone breathing counts as saving their life. Khal Drogo died in Season 1 from an infected scratch, and that single death is the reason Game of Thrones became the sprawling, decade-long saga we know. Take Drogo out of the equation, put him back on that horse alive, and the entire show collapses into 3 seasons, maybe less. Let me explain why, because this goes much deeper than most people think. Before we get into the alternate timeline stuff, we need to understand what Khal Drogo actually represented in the world of Game of Thrones. Because a lot of people remember him as the big guy with the long braid who died too soon and inspired the name Drogon. That is accurate, but it sells him short by a massive margin. The world George R.R. Martin built, the Dothraki were not just scary riders with swords. They were the single most dominant military force on the continent of Essos. At the height of Dothraki power, a unified khalasar numbered around 80,000 mounted warriors. To put that in perspective, the Battle of the Trident, which was one of the largest military engagements in Westerosi history, involved roughly 80,000 soldiers on both sides combined. The Dothraki could field that on their own. Just one khalasar. And Drogo was not some middle-of-the-pack Khal, he was the undefeated one. The show goes out of its way to establish this with a very specific visual detail. In Dothraki culture, when a warrior loses in battle, he has to cut his hair. It is not just cultural, it is a public declaration of defeat worn on your head for everyone to see. Drogo's braid goes all the way down his back. That braid is a war record, and it is spotless. Viserys Targaryen, who spent most of his time being annoying and underestimating everything around him, still had enough sense to recognize that Drogo was, in his own words, one of the finest killers alive. That description coming from Viserys, a person whose judgment was almost always wrong, somehow lands as a genuine compliment. So when Drogo makes that oath in Season 1, that passionate speech where he vows to sail wooden horses across the black salt water, to kill men in iron suits, to tear down their stone houses, and to place his son on the Iron Throne, that is not empty bravado. That is a credible threat backed by an army that had never lost. The Seven Kingdoms had no real answer for it, not in Season 1. So how does the most feared warlord in the known world go out? A scratch. A chest wound from a fight he won easily against a challenger inside his own khalasar. Drogo kills the man with his bare hands, ripping his tongue out through his throat, which is about as dramatic an execution as you can have. And then he refuses to properly treat the cut because in Dothraki culture, showing concern over a wound is the same as showing weakness. Daenerys, who by this point genuinely loves him, brings in a healer named Mirri Maz Duur. Now Mirri Maz Duur is one of the most quietly devastating characters in the entire show. She is a Lazarene woman whose village was destroyed by Drogo's own khalasar. She watched her people get enslaved and killed, and now she's being asked to save the man who gave the order. She agrees to help. Key word there is technically. She performs a blood magic ritual that keeps Drogo's heart beating, his body function, his lungs expand and contract, but nobody is home. Drogo stares at nothing, responds to nothing, recognizes nothing. He's breathing furniture. Daenerys asks Mirri when he will be himself again. Mirri gives her the answer that hits like a freight train: when the sun rises in the west, sets in the east, when the seas go dry, when the mountains blow in the wind like leaves. Never, the answer is never. And Daenerys makes the choice to end his life rather than let him exist in that state. That decision is the moment the entire narrative engine of Game of Thrones ignites. Because what comes next is the funeral pyre, the dragon eggs, and the birth of Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. 3 dragons that had not existed in the world for nearly 2 centuries. The entire Daenerys storyline, from the Unsullied to Meereen to Dragonstone to King's Landing, runs on the fuel of that one death. Without Drogo dying, none of it happens. Now let us actually run the simulation. Drogo lives, the wound gets properly treated, he leads his khalasar west, he crosses the narrow sea as he promised. Here is the first massive problem that Westeros now faces. The Seven Kingdoms in Season 1 are not united. They are the opposite of united. You have the Lannisters in the south running the crown, the Starks in the north dealing with the loss of Ned. Stannis and Renly splitting the Baratheon claim into 2 separate factions. The Greyjoys doing their own thing in the Iron Islands. The Tyrells sitting on the most powerful army in the south and waiting to see which way the wind blows. 100,000 Dothraki cavalry landing on the coasts of Westeros would immediately change the political math. Not gradually, overnight. The Lannisters, for all of Tywin's strategic genius, are playing a land-based power game. Knights, castles, siege equipment, formations, supply lines. The Dothraki do not fight like that. They swarm, they outflank. They live on horseback and move faster than any Westerosi army is equipped to counter. The terrain of the Westerlands and the Reach would give defenders some advantage, but the open fields of the Riverlands and the Northern Plains, that is Dothraki home territory, wide open ground where cavalry dominates. Every faction in Westeros would be forced into an uncomfortable conversation. The enemy of my enemy is suddenly very relevant. You would be looking at a Season 2 that is entirely dominated by emergency alliances, desperate diplomacy, and battles that make Blackwater look like a skirmish. That is a compelling second season by any measure. The Lannisters would not be dismissing Daenerys as a minor threat across the sea anymore. They would be in the same conversation as everyone else, trying to figure out how to stop an army they have never seen fight. But here is where it gets complicated. Because the Dothraki are terrifying in open-field cavalry battles, they are not equipped for everything else. Castles, the Dothraki have no siege tradition. They do not build siege towers. They do not understand fortification warfare the way Westerosi commanders do. Harrenhal alone, even in its ruined state, could hold a garrison against a Dothraki force indefinitely just by closing its gates. Castle Black was held by a few hundred men against 100,000 wildlings for an extended period. Dothraki cavalry cannot climb walls. Weather, Westeros in autumn and approaching winter creates conditions that the Dothraki, who come from the open grasslands of Essos, have never trained in. Mud slows horses. Cold affects morale. Supply lines across the narrow sea are a logistical nightmare for a culture that has historically raided its way to resources rather than maintaining supply chains. Discipline, the Dothraki fight as individual warriors seeking personal glory as much as they fight as a coordinated unit. A Khal can direct the general charge, but coordinated multi-flank battlefield tactics of the kind that Tywin Lannister executes regularly, that requires a different kind of military structure than what the Dothraki have. Season 8 already showed us the ceiling. The Dothraki charge into the long night and get wiped out almost immediately, not because they are weak, but because the enemy they faced did not respond to cavalry tactics. A sufficiently prepared Westerosi defense, perhaps not winning easily but surviving long enough, is plausible. And a drawn-out campaign with mounting Dothraki casualties would erode the Khalasar's loyalty to the cause. Because in Dothraki culture, a Khal who leads them to losses eventually stops being a Khal. This is the trap Drogo would have walked into. The finest killer in the world, leading an army that was built for speed and dominance, colliding with a continent that had every incentive to figure out how to slow him down. In this alternate timeline, Daenerys is not the central figure. She is the Khaleesi, the symbolic wife, the political justification for the invasion. The claim to the Iron Throne in Drogo's army is technically hers, but functionally it is his. The Lannisters had a line in the show about Daenerys being a minor threat because she had no army, no fleet, and no dragons. In this world, two of those three things are still true. She has an army because it is Drogo's. She has no fleet because the Dothraki would have to acquire one the same way they did in the books, through raiding and purchasing. And she has no dragons because Drogo never dies and the pyre never happens. That changes everything about her arc. The entire journey of Daenerys becoming the mother of dragons, the breaker of chains, the unburnt, all of that is built on the foundation of her loss. She is shaped into a ruler through grief and survival. Without those experiences, she remains something closer to what she was in the early episodes. A displaced princess attached to a powerful husband. This is not a criticism of the character. It is an observation about how the story works. The dragon eggs sit in their chest, not hatching, not doing anything unless something catastrophic happens to trigger them. And the catastrophic thing that triggered them was the loss of Drogo and the loss of Rhaego, channeled through Mirri Maz Duur's fire. No tragedy, no dragons, and without dragons, the balance of power in Westeros stays entirely within the realm of conventional warfare. Here is the angle that I think is most underrated in this whole discussion. Drogo's survival does not just affect Daenerys, it completely reshapes Jon Snow's story and possibly makes him a more compelling character. Jon Snow in the show as we got it follows a fairly clean hero arc. He is the reluctant leader who keeps getting pulled back into responsibility. He takes the black, he becomes Lord Commander, he dies and comes back. He becomes king in the north. He finds out he is actually Aegon Targaryen, and then he just refuses the throne and goes north with the free folk. It is a satisfying arc for a certain kind of character, but it is also very predictable once you know the template. Now put Drogo in the picture. Samwell Tarly still discovers the truth of Jon's parentage because that is tied to separate research he was already doing. The information still gets out, but now Jon's response to it is different because the context is entirely different. In the original show, finding out he is a Targaryen heir meant navigating the emotional minefield of his relationship with Daenerys. In this alternate world, there is no romantic relationship. There is Daenerys, the wife of the man leading an invading army toward Westeros, and there is Jon, who is technically the rightful heir to the throne she is fighting for on behalf of her husband. That is a completely different kind of dilemma. Jon does not just have to deal with the question of whether he wants the throne. He now has to deal with the question of whether refusing the throne means the Iron Throne goes to a child whose father just tore through Westeros with 100,000 riders. Jon only takes leadership when he has no other choice. The Dothraki invasion would be exactly the kind of situation that removes all his other choices. And a Jon Snow who is being pushed toward claiming power not out of personal ambition, but out of the logic of the moment is a much more interesting Jon Snow to watch. There's a version of this alternate timeline where Drogo wins. The Dothraki overwhelm enough of Westeros through sheer speed and numbers. The Seven Kingdoms, unable to fully unite in time, fall one region at a time. House Lannister makes compromises. The wall remains standing because the Night King has not moved yet. And then winter comes and the Night King moves. Season 8 already showed us this ending with the Dothraki. They charged into the dark and disappeared. The Whites do not tire. They do not feel pain. They do not respond to cavalry tactics because a horse does not scare something that is already dead. The Dothraki are devastating against living opponents who can be intimidated. Against the Night King's army, they are fast kindling. In this version of events, Westeros has been weakened by months or years of Dothraki invasion. The established military structures are damaged. The castles that could have served as defensive positions against the dead have been compromised or destroyed. The population has been scattered, and now the Night King arrives into a continent that is already partially broken. That is a genuinely dark ending for a show that was always honest about the cost of power games. The great game burns, winter wins, and the people who spent years fighting over the Iron Throne handed the advantage to the only enemy that was never playing the game at all. It is also, in a strange way, more internally consistent than some of what we actually got in Season 8. George R.R. Martin has talked about the idea that traditional fantasy tends to protect its important characters. The hero survives because the story needs them. The mentor dies at the right moment to motivate the protagonist. Everything follows a kind of narrative logic where death is functional and usually expected. Martin's entire project in A Song of Ice and Fire was to break that agreement with the reader. Death is not functional in his world. It is random. It is cruel. It comes from an infected scratch that a more careful man would have treated properly. It comes from a traitor's blade in a place that should have been safe. It comes from a witch who technically kept her word. Drogo's death is not just a plot point. It is a demonstration of the book's thesis. The most dangerous man in the world is not safe from hubris, from pride, from the refusal to acknowledge vulnerability. The same qualities that made him the greatest Khal, the unbroken braid, the refusal to show weakness, are exactly the qualities that kill him. And Martin uses that death to ignite the entire rest of the story. The dragons exist because Drogo died. The mother of dragons exists as a concept because Drogo died. The long road from the shores of Essos to King's Landing is built on that single moment of refusing to properly bandage a wound. That is remarkable writing when you look at the chain reaction. So here is where we land. Khal Drogo living would have compressed Game of Thrones into something like 3 seasons. Season 1 ends with him crossing the narrow sea. Season 2 is the invasion and the desperate defense of Westeros. Season 3 is either the defeat of Drogo or the arrival of the Night King into a damaged continent. There are no dragons in this version, no Unsullied, no liberation of the slave cities, no long battle for Meereen, no Jon Snow resurrection, none of the material that fills seasons 4 through 6. And none of the dragons means none of the aerial combat. No Blackwater rush burning on Dragonfire. No Drogon arriving at the Field of Fire. No sequence where a single dragon dismantles an entire Lannister supply column in about 4 minutes of television that remains some of the most impressive visual storytelling the show ever produced. Drogo's death is the engine of Game of Thrones, not Ned Stark's execution, though that established the rules, not the Red Wedding, though that cemented them. It is Drogo dying quietly in a tent, staring at nothing, while Daenerys holds a pillow and makes the hardest decision of her life. Everything that made the show what it was at its peak. The dragons, the Khalasar riding into Westeros under a queen's command, the entire 7-season extension, all of it traces back to one man refusing to treat a chest wound because he thought showing weakness was worse than dying. He was wrong. And that mistake gave us one of the most ambitious television stories ever told.